All right, hello. I hope this works. I hope it's working. There we are. So, hopefully you can hear me. I'll go back through and listen through just to make sure. I tried this once before and my video was too long, so I'm gonna try to shorten it up this time. My topic was Chinese philosophy, and more importantly, like the influence of Chinese philosophy. Um, to look into that more, in this presentation, I'm going to be going over Confucianism, Taoism or Taoism, legalism, and then finally Buddhism. So these were kind of the four main schools of thought during the Warring States period. And I was wrong about that. Actually, they originated during the Warring States period. So during this period, there was a great war between these seven states here. At the end of this war, the Qin state would come out and be victorious. Um, During this time, agriculture tools and weaponry innovations were coming about, and agriculture is the most important of all of those because with agriculture, there's more food. With more food, you can have more people living more compact and small, like communal living areas turned into towns and cities. And because of this growth of people into like certain areas, and then also like all of the war going on, philosophers of this time started forming new ideas. So the first one I want to talk about is Confucius. So Confucius was a philosopher and a teacher. He was a student of Lao Tzu, who was the founder of Taoism, which I'll talk about a little later. So Confucius focused on the importance of tradition and compassion. He lived by the Ren, or today we would call the Golden Rule. It was something similar to treat others how you want to be treated. Um, in his opinion, politically, leaders needed to set positive examples. Educationally, schools and children and people in general should be taught to live with integrity and to live by the golden rule or by the Ren. And he's most well known for his popular sayings and his teachings. And his students compiled these sayings and these teachings into what became the Analects of Confucius, which were the sacred texts per se of Confucianism. So Confucianism was a main religion, not necessarily a religion. They considered it a social order. The Analects were what established like the social values that Confucianists would live by. They were known for having a focus on self-discipline and civilized behavior. They believed that individuals could be taught to be good, um, regardless of whatever their moral standpoint might be. They could be taught like a certain way to think. The purpose of the individual under Confucianism was to help other individuals and to live spiritually. Per se, Confucius thought that the essence of life was in like relationships with other people and helping other people. Another little fun fact off that is students were taught to that each relationship they have with another human, they have certain roles and expectations that they need to live up to. So they would try to live up to that. And the whole point was to live by the golden rule or the Ren. And the symbol to the right there is the Ren. Moving on from that, the influence of Confucianism today has been pretty far spread. It served as a response to legalism of the time, which was the dominant philosophy when it was coming up, which legalism is very different, and I'll talk about that a little later. It became the supreme school of thought during the Han Dynasty, so it eventually grew to be like the main like thought process of like the Chinese people. Um, from there, even to modern times, Confucius is now known globally. Everybody's at least heard of him. They might not know like a specific saying, but they know who he was, kind of. And his sayings are often quoted by world leaders. And his ideals would later appear in more modern schools of thought. So the second school of thought I want to talk about is Taoism. So this man's name is Lao Tzu or Lao Zi. He was the founder of the Tao, which the Tao was essentially this idea for like the essence of life, and it represented like essence and balance in life, like maybe like an internal force or like a life force that goes through us. Um, Lao Tzu in Chinese means old master. He was actually a teacher of Confucius, so Taoism's a little bit older than Confucianism, where Confucius tried to enact social order and bring about social change and set certain social rules. Lao Tzu felt that this was a battle that Confucius would not be able to win, and instead felt that people should instead spend time meditating in order to find and become connected with the Tao. So the best way to distinguish Taoism is from its differences from Confucianism. So, like I said, Confucianists felt the need to set certain rules, and with this, the Taoists believed that these rules were too discriminatory. They were too black and white. So instead, Taoists felt that life should be about focusing and finding their own personal place in the world. So they would spend their lives in search of the Tao. Those who found the Tao, such as Lao Tzu, who was known as like a man who became enlightened and found the Tao, they would focus their whole life on like finding and becoming enlightened with the Tao. Leaders they're supposed to have a very hands-off leadership style. They should be elected based off of how connected they were to the Tao. And then the Tao should be like what governs the people. Subjects, the whole idea was that if the leader followed the Tao, then subjects would follow the Tao shortly after. A popular symbol that kind of represents Taoism was the yin yang, which just essentially illustrates like the balance and like how the Tao works in like the lives of people. So Taoism today, modern Taoism, there's at least 30,000 Taoists living in the United States. Many incorporate old Taoist traditions and with other religious practices, but it's pretty difficult to be like a full Taoist in America with consumerism and the influence of Christianity. They've had some issues grouping. There's a lack of central region or really a community just because there's so few people that claim to be Taoist in America. And because of this, American Taoism is emerging as a different form of Taoism. So it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more adjusted to American life. And that map on the left is actually a world map based off of Taoists by geography. As you can see, most of them still are in China, but there are Taoists that have spread over the world. A lot of them spread to Japan and the Philippines, but they are mostly centralized in Asia. So moving on from Taoism, Shang Yang was known as the founder of legalism. He was the admiral for the Qin dynasty, and his philosophy was rooted not in religion, not in any sort of purpose of life meaning, but it was rooted in societal productivity among people. He felt that the purpose of life was to lead and become a strong and powerful nation. Because of this, the way he thought to do this was to impose laws, strict, firm, like set and ground laws, and have harsh punishments for those if people broke those laws. These punishments could be, and usually were, death. There were stories of people that knew of other people that broke the law, and both parties would be killed just for knowing about the law breaking. He influenced the Book of Lord Shang, which became the main legalist text and pointed out the main legalist ideals. And then his life ended when a prince that he had earlier punished by one of his own rulers had him killed by having him pulled apart by chariots. And then they also had his family executed. So he was wrapped up into a pretty dictatorship sort of violent portion of what China was at the time. But his book became the foundation of legalism. So the ideas of legalism is that individuals are ethically flawed and morally wrong and need a strong system to govern them. They believe that a strong government with strong rules and harsh punishments could help direct these people toward helping the country. And individuals in this time would achieve rank simply based off of their military successes. So being able to defeat your enemies in battle was a sign of like good leadership skills. So those who had good military records would be promoted. Those who didn't would be demoted. Lawbreakers would be killed. Like most lawbreakers, they would have them punished in some way, usually violently. There were some good things about it for the time period. It helped unite the country during the Warring States period, but after the Warring States period, it declined very quickly. Many farmers, lower class citizens were not fans of it at all, as it really only helped out like the big government. And those who opposed legalism ended up finding solace in like Taoism and Confucianism as a backup. The influence of legalism, as a full principle, it hasn't really spread that much, but we can still see it in dictatorship countries like North Korea. There's also countries that practice subtle legalism, and that can be seen less as dictatorship and harsh punishments, but more as like information censorship or information feeding, like telling people certain things. Propaganda is another one. And it could be argued that every country in the world still has some principles like this. I feel like a few are necessary in order to govern like a group of people correctly, but overall, it's not really a good philosophy to live or like run a country by. As it's shown that in practice, long term, it does not work. So moving on, the final religion I want to talk about is Buddhism. So Buddhism is the only one of the three that does not have its origin in China. It was actually originated in India. So Siddhartha Gautama was an Indian teacher who sat under a tree and from doing this became enlightened. So during his enlightenment, he figured out four essential truths: the truth of suffering, the origin of suffering, liberation from suffering, and then cessation of suffering through the Eightfold Path, which I know there was another presentation on Buddhism that's a lot more into detail. So if you want to know more about that, I would go watch that presentation. Like I said, it didn't originate in China, but this became a very big and important part of Chinese culture. So Buddhism in China was a little bit different than in India. It was brought from India to China by missionaries on the Silk Road for trade routes. And when they got here, they talked to Taoists and Confucianists. And it appealed a lot to Taoists because where Taoists were basically told to just meditate on their own and figure out enlightenment on their own, Buddhism offered a sort of path and a few steps in order to achieve this happiness and this enlightenment. And this type of Buddhism became known as Mahayana Buddhism. And it absorbed a lot of Taoists, like I said, by offering this path. And another difference was that where Indians treated the Buddha like he was an enlightened individual, the Chinese treated and worshipped him like he was a god. There was also some differences in how he was portrayed. Many of the early Buddhas and early Buddha statues, he's portrayed as being very thin, but in China, he was portrayed as being very healthy sized. So moving on from that, Mahayana Buddhism today. Buddhists in general make up about 9 to 10% of the global population. And modern Buddhism was heavily influenced by the principles of Taoism and Confucianism because as Buddhism traveled to China, it mixed with the ideas of Taoism and Confucianism as a way to live life and developed into the Buddhism that it is today. And today, even though China is a melting pot of different religions, it's still the most majority religion in the country. So, overall, the takeaways from the influence of Chinese philosophy is the different principles have shown and had influence on the other religions when it comes to the search of peace and harmony. Other religions have looked toward these Chinese ideals into finding and living life in their own way, in a peaceful way. It was one of the earliest proofs that a legalistic, like totalitarian society always ends in a revolution and always ends with individual. It's never worked out fully. And then finally, Modern governments and religions today all have little details and pulls from ancient Chinese teachings. Um, so yeah.